I was really delighted to be asked to facilitate this discussion tonight with 4 such interesting and knowledgeable panelists, each of whom have their own unique story and perspective. The theme of our session tonight is what can we do? But before we ask that, I guess we have to reflect on do about what? What are the key issues that face the church and are preventing progress? I've asked each of our panelists to prepare a very brief statement on one of the themes that they consider to be at the heart of the church's problems. And we'll hear about those themes a little bit later on. But it's very important to remember that the reason we need change is for survivors. And I did want to keep their voices very much at the heart of tonight's session. So we will be starting with some case studies and statements from survivors, which I'll put to the panelists and ask them to comment on and to discuss the issues that arise from that. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of those who sent on statements in advance of this session. I'd like to reassure all of you that they were all read. They're very moving, many of them. And although we can't use them in full, I've certainly used them to shape some of the questions that I will ask the panelists. So thank you very sincerely for that. But this is also a session in which hopefully if we get some time at the end of all of that, we can open up to some questions from the audience. So as was mentioned, if you would like to ask a question, please put it into chat and send it to me directly. If you want it to be anonymous, don't use your name. But if you're happy for your first name to be used and for you to be brought in to ask the question yourself, please just put your name at the start of the question. So I'm going to come to our 4 panelists now, and I would like to ask them to introduce themselves very briefly to us. I know that for most of the audience, each of these people will be well known, but for those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, I'd like to ask each panelist who they are, what their story is with the church, and just what their relationship now, if any, is with the Catholic Church. And I'm going to come to Anne first. Anne, as many of you will know, will not be shown on the screen. She preferred to protect her anonymity. She has been known in the press as A711 because that was her number when she gave evidence to the independent inquiry on sexual abuse. So Anne, if I could come to you first, could you just tell us a little bit about your story and your connection now to the church?
Thank you, Catherine, and good evening, everybody. I was sexually abused by a priest from the age of 15, and that abuse continued for several years and changed my life forever. I reported the abuse to the church in 2016 when I was in my early 50s, and only after my mother's death. And the response of the church, and in particular of the diocese who was overseeing the case, was truly appalling. Its default position was hostile and defensive and caused me immense distress. And that's been documented publicly in the evidence that I gave to the inquiry. I discovered through a subject access request that I was being described in emails by safeguarding personnel as manipulative, needy and a bully, and that Cardinal Nichols was not willing to engage with me. And in the end, I put in a claim, and again, this is there in the media, I put in a claim against Westminster Diocese to hold them accountable really for how they had treated me, and to say that they couldn't treat survivors in the way they were doing, and that claim was settled last October. As a consequence of my historic abuse, I think my relationship with the Catholic Church has been a complicated one. There's been a pretty consistent anger that bubbles under the surface, but at the same time, there's been my own personal faith, which has kept me in the church for a long time. And I think I reconciled my belonging to the church by convincing myself that my abuse had been the actions of one man. And for a long time, I was able to separate that from the church. And it's only been many years later now, when I came forward to report the historic abuse and experience what I did, that I discovered actually the church itself as an institution is also an abuser. And it was at that point that I had to question my own belonging to it. And I suppose that's really where I'm at now.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think even in your introduction, you've raised so many issues that we're going to be returning to. If I could come to Tom now.
Sure. Okay, I'm Tom Doyle. I'm an American. I was an active priest since 1970, quite a few years ago. I have been deeply involved in the sexual abuse issue since 1984 and was directly involved at the Vatican Embassy where I worked in Washington when the first major case broke through the thick blanket of secrecy and exposed what had been in existence for centuries to the public. I've been involved in it since then on every level imaginable, steadily in a number of countries, with victims, with perpetrators, with families, with the ones who don't really seem to have much interest in what I have to say are the bishops, not surprisingly. So my relationship with the institutional Catholic Church is zero. I do not have one. The only time we relate is when I'm in court testifying on behalf of victims, or when I'm at something such as the Royal Commission. And I know Francis is here, and I think that was one of the greatest honors I've had in my life, was to be able to be there, to be involved with the Royal Commission, because that was more than the gold standard of what should really be happening. So that was a high moment. That's the extent of my connection with the institutional church. Now, the body of Christ, the believers, the people, that's another thing. With them, I'm very much involved and part of that, but I'm not part of the institution, of the structure, of the whatever you want to call it. I'm simply not part of it. I'm not an active priest. I'm not an active Catholic, but I think I'm an active Christian.
Thank you very much, Tom. I know that your huge experience is going to be very useful to us tonight. If I could come now to Brian. Brian, could you give us a brief introduction to your story?
Yeah, okay. My name is Brian Devlin. I live in Scotland. I was a seminarian in 1978 and went to Drygrange Seminary in the south of Scotland. During my time there, it was a major seminary, so I was 18. During my time there, it eventually became clear to me that my spiritual director was grooming me without my knowledge and my naivety towards some sort of sexual relationship with him during, and particularly this was during moments of prayer and confession when he started his grooming behaviour. He left the seminary to become the rector of a minor seminary in Aberdeen in north of Scotland, and I continued in my studies. I eventually became ordained, and 3 months after I was ordained, I found out that the spiritual director, whose name was Father Keith O'Brien, was to be appointed as the Archbishop of St Andrews in Edinburgh, my Archbishop. So after 7 years of study for the priesthood, I had to make the very painful decision at the time to leave the priesthood, because in all conscience I couldn't commit to living a life under someone who had essentially tried to sexually abuse me. Since then, I've gone on, like Tom, I've not been part of the institutional church at all until I drifted away from the church. There's an Irish writer called Maeve Binchy, and she coined the phrase that she was a collapsed Catholic. And I think that's very much how I see myself, as a collapsed Catholic. I still understand that Catholicism has helped to form me, but I don't see myself in any sense as part of the institutional church. I am a whistleblower, because in 2012, 2013, through Catherine Devaney, who's here, we blew the whistle on Cardinal O'Brien's predation amongst priests in the Archdiocese, and that resulted in him eventually losing his position and not being able to attend the conclave to appoint Pope Francis. So I do feel that I've got a role as a whistleblower within the church. I think that there is, whether you want to call it a ministry or not, but there certainly is a role for people to call out the malfeasance within the bishops and the cardinals in the church. And I see myself as the grit in the shoe of the bishops in the church.
A good thing to be, Brian. Thank you so much for that. And I think the whole notion of whistleblowing, when we're looking at what can we do, and the idea of calling out what we see, will be an important one in our discussion tonight. So thank you for that. And if finally I could come to Francis. Welcome, Francis, from Australia. Could you give us a brief background to your story and your connection to the church?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everybody. My most recent role has been the Chief Executive of the Truth, Justice and Healing Council, which was the coordinating body for the Catholic Church as it engaged with the Royal Commission that was held here in Australia from 2012 through to 2017. And obviously across that time, the revelations of abuse and cover-up were made very plain. And as Tom referred to, it was a very open and comprehensive inquiry, came up with a massive range of recommendations and so on. I'm currently the chair of the Martyr Group of Hospitals in Queensland, and I'm also chair of Catholic Social Services across Australia. May I say that I'm still a practicing Catholic. I certainly have great issue with how the institutional church not only organised itself around its own self-interests when it came to child sexual abuse, but I have a huge interest in how we as Catholics, we the church, can be a responsive and relevant faith community in our postmodern world. And it's that energy and that confidence that keeps carrying me on. And I'd just like to say thank you to the two people who have had direct abuse and their stories already today. And it's never easy to tell them. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Francis. Thanks to all of you and a very warm welcome. So I'm going to start with our first victim statement. And this is from our survivor statement. And I know there's a kind of, difficulty with language there, in that some people object to victim and some object to survivor because they say they're not surviving. So this is from Patrick Mills, and Patrick has very kindly agreed for his name to be used. He says there's nothing left for him to hide. And I'm going to read you just a brief extract from his statement and ask you to comment on a couple of issues here. As a child, I was unofficially indentured into a sexually abusive Catholic world of clergy, religious orders and laity until I escaped at age 16. The impact it's had on me was to turn lead into gold as a successful commercial writer, drawing on Catholic abuse for inspiration. Maybe that's why it didn't scar me with drugs or alcohol, but it certainly scarred me in all the other obvious ways: PTSD, sleep issues, and so forth. But in recent years, that alchemy has been a double-edged sword because it's made me increasingly militant on exposing a number of issues which are usually ignored, such as the evils of canon law. In fact, there are two areas where I think no one in the UK, at least, is pursuing, even though it's been proven elsewhere in the world, namely the sexually abusive role of the Catholic laity, who currently are presented as shocked and innocent bystanders, and the existence of Catholic clergy and laity paedophile rings, organised systemic sexual abuse. I've presented evidence to Safeguarding, who have passed it to Police Operation Hydrant. Very strong words there. I'm going to come to you first, Tom, because Patrick mentions the evils of canon law. Very strong statement. Is canon law, in your opinion, evil, or is it simply applied evilly at times?
Well, it's an inordinate object. It is a legal system that has been, actually, it's the longest continuously functioning legal system in the world. And as far as redress and helping people whom the institution has harmed, it is close to useless. It's a fascinating entity to study. I've been very much involved in the medieval dimension, the historical dimension of it. But as far as helping victims, bringing justice, bringing redress, it has been close to useless, and I would say totally useless, except for the fact that over the past few years, because of the agitation and the work of the victims, the survivors, their supporters, there has been a force on the bishops to actually utilize some of the portions of canon law that should be utilized to help victims. But that's very, very small, very, very small. As you know, it's a legal system that exists in service to the monarchy, to the heads of the church. And they're the ones who decide what it's going to do, what it means. I remember learning very, very early on that canon law is what the bishops want it to be. That's a true fact. It's true. It has been ignored and intentionally neglected by ecclesiastical personages whose obligation was to uphold it, primarily to uphold the spiritual, moral welfare, spiritual welfare of everyone, especially those who are in the most danger, namely now the survivors of sexual abuse. Is that evil or not? I think it's beyond evil. And I think that it has revealed to me over the 35, 38 years I've been involved in this, that what we have been dealing with is the very, very dark, dark side of the institution. And it's manifested itself in many, many ways. And one of them has been ignoring canon law. Now, I will say this in answer to his question. On the flip side of that, I've been an expert witness and a consultant in civil cases and criminal cases around the world. The largest type of ammunition that I walk into court with has been canon law, because the courts want to know what were they supposed to do and what didn't they do. And I can easily say, this is what they were supposed to do and this is what they didn't do. So in a sense, it's being hung by your own petard, and they are the law itself and the intentional misuse and abuse of it for self-serving purposes is coming back to haunt the system. And I think above all, it shows that you really cannot have a decent legal system in our world that is autocratic in nature.
Thank you, Tom. Brian, I wonder, did you come up against canon law when you made your complaint to the Catholic Church? Was it used against you? Brian, I think you're still muted.
It's muted.
Thank you.
I wouldn't say that canon law was specifically used against us, but I think what we did face when we were told to go through and exhaust every internal process, which we did do through canon law, which meant making statements to nuncios and so on. And essentially what happened was, and a lot of victims feel this and experience this, is we heard nothing. They just ignored us. And it's that wall of silence, that abusive silence, actually, that whether that's canon law or not, it's pretty terrible behavior for a church that claims to be what it claims to be. I went on to work in a health organization here in quite a high position, and let me tell you that in this secular world, in business, you would not get away with that sort of behavior. The church seems to, though, and I think it's one of the biggest scandals that I've observed. So, yeah.
Thank you, Brian. Francis, I wonder, do you see it as part of the problem that the Catholic Church is allowed in its way to have its own status as a separate state, its own law system, its own diplomats? Is that really a big part of the problem that we're facing here? They have too much power.
Well, I think specifically around canon law and how it played out during the scandal, at least in the Australian experience, was that it was a convenience to enable the church to keep its own business private. That's the first thing, I think. And you often hear people talk about, you know, pulling on canon law, a bit like snake oil. Somebody seems to say, this is how it's got to happen inside the church. And of course, most people don't know what canon law is or what it says or how it should be interpreted. So that takes you to another point, which is, you know, and we'll talk about it later, the whole culture of clericalism. But can I say the most important thing that was revealed in my mind through the scandal in Australia is the Catholic Church should not be able to investigate itself. When it comes to these issues, no matter whether it's a local diocesan process or a national process set up by the church, investigating itself, there's always a conflict of interest. Yeah. And it's the conflict of interest that drove the secrecy. It's the conflict of interest that uses things like misinterpreting the canon law to keep inquiries and scrutiny away. So I think very fundamentally, the church's canon law can be quite consistent and it should be based on a healthy theology.
Thank you.
That's the whole point.
And I'm not sure whether you would have come up against canon law as such, but you certainly came up against the effects that Francis has just outlined there, didn't you, when you put your complaint to the church, that kind of resistance to what you were trying to present to them?
I think definitely the inconsistencies as well, which happen because they suit the line of defence that the church might be taking at the time. I mean, I certainly found towards the end of my case that canon law can be used by the church when it suits it, or it can be disregarded. And so, for example, in my case, the priest who abused me, his case should have gone to Rome, if you're following what canon law is saying, but his religious superior didn't feel that it warranted him sending it to Rome. So, you know, there's canon law there that on the one hand could be used in a way that is just and fair, but the church chooses when to use it, and there's total inconsistency.
Yeah, very difficult to contest that, isn't it? I'm actually going to ask all of you now more generally to respond to the second issue that's in Patrick's statement, and that's about the laity and the idea of the laity not being innocent bystanders. How do you react to that? Francis, could I maybe come to you first on that one?
Well, look, at the end of the day, we all have to take responsibility for our church and the culture that we allow to permeate in that church. And part of that culture is the fact that we as laity are too submissive, too compliant, almost too forgiving in the wrong sense of the term. And we need to take collective responsibility for what has happened, but also the way in which people still are abused within that culture. And I don't just mean sexually abused, that vulnerable people are at risk. And so, yes, I agree. I think we as the laity need to see ourselves as part of the solution. And to be part of the solution, you need to name those elements of our culture that are dysfunctional and abusive.
Thank you. Tom, I wonder, have you come across what Patrick refers to there in terms of priest and laity paedophile rings? Is this something that you've experienced?
I experienced it, but I can't honestly say that I can give you detail right now. I know more about, if you want to call it a ring, priests, clergy who were connected with one another and who were passing unsuspecting but co-opted victims from one to another. And I know of a few situations where there were lay individuals who were involved in this, who were supporting it. Now that, to me, that's nothing short of criminal behavior. And we can talk about that till we're blue in the face, but there's one basic solution. You call the police, they're prosecuted as criminals, and they're put away, period, end of story. So I think, but I want to second what Francis so eloquently said, first about canon law, but second about the laity. And I believe from my own experience, the unwillingness or inability of so many laity who've been co-opted by clericalism to speak up, knowing how evil this situation is, especially parents, parents who would be afraid to challenge the institution after their own children had been violated. I will say one experience I had several years ago in the state of Washington, which is on the other side of the country in the US. And I was out there to give a talk, and I was invited to go to a meeting where there were a number of survivors, victims, and their families, and the local bishop. And there was a woman at the meeting who had been extremely active in the church as a layperson. She had been a director of CCD and a number of things. And two of her children had been sexually abused by a priest. And so she brought suit against the diocese and pursued it hard. And I still recall the bishop saying to her, first name I believe was Francis, I'm scandalized. You know, what, the way you're attacking the church, what happened to your faith? And she looked him straight in the eye and she said, I'm going to tell you something, and don't you forget it. I was a mother long before I was a Catholic, and I'll be a mother long after I'm a Catholic. And don't you forget that. That's the key. The people you're dealing with, the hierarchs, have never been parents. They have no clue what parents go through when their children, whether they're adults or children, go through this kind of a nightmare. So I think the dumbing down of the laity, but I've gradually seen that change over my experience. When they say the church has done nothing, yeah, the church has done a lot, but it's the lay part of the church that has done it. They've pushed it, they've insisted. The action has taken place in the civil courts and in arenas such as the Royal Commission. That's where the change has happened. Not talking to bishops and saying, you know, respond to the gospel. That goes in one ear and not the other. It means nothing. But you have to have a hammer. And you have to say, look, either you do this or we're going to hit you with the hammer. So take your pick. And that's what has happened. And it's been with the cooperation of lay people. But I do agree that a lot of them have remained silent. They've remained, they've been, in a sense, collaborators, quietly collaborating, supporting the system that has tried to support itself. The two expendables for the ecclesiastical system, the hierarchical system, in this have been A, the victims, they're expendable, we'd rather get rid of them, disappear them, and two, the perpetrating clergy. Get rid of them, get them out of the picture. But the one thing they don't want to mess with, and then Francis came along and changed that, is the hierarchy. We'll protect them at all costs. Well, they're on shifty ground right now too, thank God.
Yes, the what can we do that's coming out of this, it sounds from all of you as if a renegotiation of the relationship between laity and clergy and the hierarchy is long overdue. But Tom, to follow up on your story about the mother, I want to bring in a short statement here from what we'll call Case C. And Case C talks about the abuse by a priest when she was very young, and says that her father was sometimes present when the priest abused her. She adds, I also called to mind a phrase my father said more than once, and I remember clearly, children don't remember. Now, I wish that were true, but I guess this goes back to, you know, Patrick's point in his statement too, about the responsibilities of the laity and the responsibility of parents. Is this something that you think is really endemic, that parents still are frightened to challenge their local priests, or have we moved from there? And Brian, can I come to you on that one?
I don't know is the answer, the truthful answer. I hope so. I hope that they have learned, and I hope that they are moving ahead. I have my doubts in some ways. I think that there is still a deep-rooted clericalism amongst many of the laity, and I think Pope Francis was talking about that the other day. So I think that there is a move within a lot of the seminaries who seem to be churning out these priests who are more conservative now than they were way back in the 1950s. So that concerns me that the laity are flocking around those sorts of priests. And I think what Francis was talking about the sort of language that we use, the deferential language that we use when we're talking about priests and bishops and your eminences and your graces and your father, we have to get away from that. We have to have a mature relationship between laity and the clergy. They both have their roles, but I think we've got a long way to go yet.
And I'd like to come to you here because, you know, we have a number of statements, one from Leonard, who talks about the fact that his parents were kind of, you know, hoodwinked by their local priest who abused him and his sibling. And I wondered about your own parents, Anne. Did they have any inkling of what was going on in your case? Did they turn a blind eye, or did they simply not know? Were they that trusting?
They were that trusting. I think when I talked in the first session about, you know, the grooming by this priest, it was a grooming not just of myself, but of a community, and that included my parents. And, you know, he worked his way into the family home. He became good friends with my parents. And I think, well, you know, looking back, that they didn't know, they trusted him. There was no questioning of why I would be taken off by him, you know, to go swimming or to go out. And I think he did such I wouldn't say a good job, but, you know, he deliberately set up that situation so that he had access to me in a way that wasn't questioned.
I wonder, Anne, could I also ask you about, you know, the kind of lasting effects of abuse, which again is a really important area to look at. Case C, which I've just mentioned to you, goes on to talk about the kind of lasting effects, saying being a victim of sexual abuse by a priest means having a panic attack when I walk into a church, hearing a child scream in the middle of the night and waking up only to discover it was me, praying that there is no heaven when I die, because if God forgives my abuser, he might be there too. And this raises a really important issue, I think, about the fact that there's sexual abuse, but there's lots of other forms of abuse too. And these are not isolated into an area of your life, but have long-lasting effects. Could you talk a little bit about what the lasting effects for you have been?
Well, I think the lasting effects kind of resurfaced when I came forward to the church to report what had happened to me, and to then find myself in a situation which was as traumatizing and as abusive as the situation that I'd come to report, had a massive effect on me. And so, you know, in my own life, and I talked about this before, I had had many years of psychotherapy. I had thought that I was quite sorted, but then never to know when those trigger moments are going to happen. And for instance, for me, one of those was the death of my mother. But to then find that the church could also trigger those sorts of moments, which can have an effect, you know, on your mental health, certainly. When I reported the historic abuse, I then, over the last few years, you know, went back into counselling, and it wasn't so much, you know, I had dealt in some ways with the historic abuse, but it was dealing with the dynamics again of being silent, feeling powerless, and the church, instead of reaching out and showing and demonstrating values of compassion and respect, acting in the way that my abuser had. And that was very difficult to deal with.
We also have a statement, and I'm sure you will, in some ways identify with, from somebody that we'll call Beverly, who talks about many years after she was abused, suffering from postnatal depression. So in the way that, some of your PTSD was kind of triggered by your mother's death, hers was partly triggered by the birth of her child. And she talks about the fact that the help she received was very poor, and the professionals that she consulted betrayed her privacy and talked to her family. She went on to have several suicide attempts. And it really highlights how important it is to offer the correct help. So when we're asking what can we do to support victims, and what should we be demanding? Brian, can I come to you first on this one and say, what would have helped, do you think? What would have changed your situation? What help could have been provided?
Well, certainly in the situation that I found myself in seminary, when your spiritual director starts to groom you sexually, there's nowhere to go with that information if you want to be a priest. So one of the things I think that we need to do is to look at how priests are formed. I think that abuse is learned in seminary, and all priests and all bishops go through seminary. So I think there is something there about the process in seminary that is a seedbed for this sort of behaviour. So there, very often I think that we find ourselves in a position where we have nowhere to go to, and you very often hear of people who have been abused as children, or in my case as a young adult, and they don't speak about it very much for the next 20, 30, 40 years, and then eventually somehow it comes out in whatever form. So I think that we've got an awful lot of growing up to do as an organisation, as a church. I think that we've, somebody mentioned the culture. I think it was Francis mentioned the culture of the church, and we don't have a healthy culture in the Catholic Church for these sorts of things. There is nowhere to have these conversations, and we need to, perhaps as laity, we need to start to sort that problem out for ourselves.
Francis, do you see any steps that we can take to ensure that victims are better supported within the church, knowing how much obstruction there is from the church hierarchy? What can we do as laity to change that situation?
Well, again, from the experience in Australia, listening to victims and survivors, the very first thing is they want to be believed.
Yeah.
It's a huge hurdle in the way the culture of the church has tried to deny what happened. And so I often used to hear people say, I want to be believed. And then we need to respond in that belief. So there are a few things, I think. As I said before, the church should not investigate itself. All investigations, complaints, and allegations need to be investigated independently. And the church authorities have to cop the results of that and the implications. The implications are financial, but also emotional and pastoral support, not just as an immediate package, but as an ongoing support mechanism for the individuals. The packages need to be individually designed and focused, because people have different needs. Their circumstances are different. What their lives, some have good support mechanisms, other people have nothing. Some people have found that their capacity to work has been corroded. Their capacity to build sustainable relationships is difficult. So we need to journey with people. In other words, have a mentality of restorative justice. I think that's how you start. and enable people to access the services of support they need, and don't assume that those support services need to be run by the church, because in many cases, people don't want anything to do with the formal church for the rest of their life, or in some cases for a good period of time.
Tom, do you have any views here about what people can do to support victims and how they can, you know, create change within the church?
Is that directed at me?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Tom,
sorry, I missed part of your sentence.
Okay, I'm just asking what, you know, whether you have any views about what can be done to support victims and how people can actually lobby for change to create change within the hierarchy in their response to victims.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. First, let me just speak from my own personal experience. You don't get involved in this as I have, as deeply immersed without being severely affected. And it did to me, very much so, in many ways. And my support, closest support, came from some very close friends and my family. That was the thing I depended upon most, and it's still there because I'm still wallowing in the cesspool every day. And people say, "When are you going to retire?" I say, "I'm not going to retire. I can't. I never will be able to, because the virus isn't going to go away." But what do you do? What do we do? Well, I think what we do is, first off, stop depending on the countless words and promises and procedures and protocols and all this other nonsense coming out of the voices and the talking heads of the institution. It's just words. You need action. And I think as far as action, you know, as Francis and Brian so eloquently said, people don't trust the institution. They can't possibly expect to get adequate support and healing from the outfit that really was the source of the pain and the destruction of their emotional stability and their spiritual stability. So insisting on some sort of assistance from the institution, I would say, sure, they have to help. But here's what we're going to do, bishops. You're going to pay for it. We're going to take care of it from our own resources. We're going to get competent people, of which you have none, and you are going to pay for this. Insist on that. And I think one thing I've been harping at for my whole life is the buck stops when the money stops. Now, over here, with the court system in our country is really helping in many ways, because they are really feeling the pinch, because the courts are beginning to find out just exactly how much money the institutional church has, and it's making that available to the victim. So that's one dimension. But I think the healing and the support and the belief is crucial. And that can only come from one-on-one, from people who sincerely and honestly mean it. Having an appointment with the local bishop where his chancellor's sitting there on one side and the lawyers on the other, that's not a healing experience. No. That's a re-victimization. But getting past that, and I think crucial to this, is getting past this deeply embedded attitude of deference toward the hierarchy, toward the system that runs the show. Now, we're used to that because that's been the system for centuries. But we're beyond the fact where we can go back and say, well, we have to respect and support this and so on and so forth. Forget that. The people that are most important are the ones Jesus Christ was reach out to and be there with and be healing. And those are the ones that are the most rejected and the most healing, not the ones that are dressed up looking like Christmas trees. And he would be there with those people. And we have to keep that in mind. So I think, to briefly sum it up, is concerted efforts at insistence on supporting the victims and assisting in the support the way they want to be supported and the way we, their supporters, think they should be supported in concert with them, not the way you think they should be supported. And forget all these commissions and sending them for 5 sessions with a psychologist and nonsense like that. That's just re-victimization.
But thank you, Tom. Thank you. I'm going to bring in a member of the audience here. Philip, if you would like to unmute yourself, I wonder if you'd like to ask your question yourself. So Philip wants to ask about priest abusers and the prosecutions. Are you there?
Hi, thank you, Catherine, and thank all the panel. I was just thinking, if the process, if a priest is found or alleged to have been abused, report them to the police. To me, report them to the authorities should happen, because this is a criminal offence. This isn't anything to do with church. But in England, I don't know about Scotland, but the figures in England for how the authorities, the police and the prosecution services, how they deal with any case of sexual abuse and rape, the figures are pitifully low. It is absolutely appalling, the number of successful prosecutions. And I'm just thinking, what Tom was just saying about re-victimization, it must be horrific. So it's not that, I'm taking it out from the churches, but it's a society problem as well.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that very interesting contribution. Thank you. I'd also like to bring in here somebody who would like to remain anonymous, but has asked me to share her husband's story. His father died when he was 11 years old, and the vicar of his mother's high Anglican church befriended him and his mother and offered to take him on holiday to the Holy Land. He was given alcohol and raped during the trip, and this abuse continued for several years afterwards. He didn't tell anyone until we'd been married for about 15 years, when he disclosed to me that he'd got into tens of thousands of pounds of debt, and that, sobbing, told me of the abuse he had suffered. I wrote to the Anglican bishop of the English diocese where all this took place, and I was ignored and dismissed. I eventually wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who assigned someone to investigate this vicar and perpetrator. I was told that he died in 2004, but that he had actually been accepted into the Catholic Church as a priest prior to this. My husband shies away from talking about all this now, but it has devastated our whole family. Thank you so much for sharing that really, really difficult story. And I think the whole idea of sexuality and the church's attitude to that is one which we will come back to, but we see there very clearly the terrible effects that spread out from a single abuse victim to their entire family. I'm going to move on here. I'll bring in the audience again in a while, but I'm going to ask the panel to give me their themes that they think are really significant and which we should address immediately. With apology, I'm going to ask you to be even briefer than I asked you earlier to be, because with starting late, we're a little bit tight for time here. But could I start with you, Anne? If you could just give us a brief outline of what you think your really significant issue is that you would like to see addressed.
I think this picks up from what Francis has been saying about how the church, cannot police itself and do its own investigations, because the role of lawyers and insurers influences the church's response to victims and survivors, so much so that victims and survivors almost need a health warning about what will happen when they come forward to report abuse. And I don't know if there's time, Catherine, just to give that personal example of what happened to me. When I reported my historic abuse to the church, I hadn't made a claim. I had no intention of making a claim at that point. And a very detailed statement was taken from me by a forensic psychologist. And I gave that willingly on the understanding from the psychologist that statement would be used in the risk assessment of my abuser, and any admissions the priest made about what I had said would be fed back verbally to me. But then the Westminster Diocese, who were advising the abuser's religious order, said that they weren't going to allow me any feedback at all. and they had taken legal advice from the head of the Catholic Insurance Service. Now, I don't know if people are aware of this, but this is a company in the UK that is a service, is owned by the Conference of Bishops in England and Wales and of Scotland, and it acts as an intermediary for the church with insurers and offers legal advice. So it was their advice that I was not allowed any verbal feedback, and I was left totally powerless. And it was only because the forensic psychologist, I don't even know if he was a Christian, he was independent from the church, but he appealed to the religious orders provincial and said, if you've got a shred of Christianity in you, you will allow some verbal feedback. And without that intervention, I would never have known, perhaps to this day, of the admissions that my abuser had made. So, you know, legal advice coming from the CIS, owned by the Conference of Bishops, that was what was driving the decisions and the direction of my case. It wasn't that any Christian pastoral response, and it was though, you know, the pastoral response just didn't figure. And I will cut short what I was going to say, but I just want to end by saying that I'm in contact with many survivors whose lives are on the edge because they cannot get from the church the pastoral response that they deserve. And I think, you know, the church needs leadership that's prepared to put its head above the parapet and answer the question, you know, what would Jesus do? And I actually asked Cardinal Nichols that question when I was asking him to intervene in my case. And he simply directed me back to the safeguarding office and the chief operating officer of his diocese. And the safeguarding office suggested that I spoke to Westminster's lawyers. So I think until perhaps the laity know that the money that they're putting into the collection plate, you know, is being used to fund services that are directing and influencing responses to victims and survivors in this way, you know, that's got to change.
I think a really interesting point there about money, and I think we all know that hits them where it hurts. I ask just very quickly, Francis, one of the things that's been suggested is that people stop putting money in the plate. Do you think that is an effective action that will create any kind of change in the church?
Well, as you say, I think money always makes people pay attention. I mean, the real action, of course, is that we as Catholics need to understand and take our own agency in the church, to be confident. You know, as baptized Catholics, we're all meant to be equal. I know there's a class system, clerics versus the rest, and it's the clericalism that has been such an evil element around the abuse scandal and the way it's been managed. And I think we have to stand up and be adults ourselves in the church, take agency, believe in ourselves, believe in our own conscience. And if your conscience brings you to a point where you say, I'm not going to contribute financially directly into the institution, then so be it. There are plenty of other ways in which you can support financially good works of mercy.
Okay.
And that's the point. We are a church of people, and we do many things and organize many things amongst ourselves as works of mercy and support. It doesn't have to be directly through the coffers of the first and second collection.
Thank you, Francis. I'm going to come very quickly, Brian, to you to ask about your theme. I'm going to have to kind of speed things up a little bit here and just ask we've got money from Anne. What's your burning issue?
My burning issue is power abuse. And I think it probably will be connected to what everybody else is saying. But my reflections are that we have to waken up as a Catholic community and recognise that the organisation that we belong to at its highest level acts more like a crime gang than a beatitudinal church. We need to wake up and smell the coffee. And again, Francis talked about culture, and I think culture is everything. When we listen to the bishops, they come out with all the list of the isms that are to blame for the wrong in the church, which is secularism or communism or consumerism. Francis is going to come on to the main ism for me, and that is clericalism. I think clericalism is at the heart of everything or most things that is going wrong with the church. I do think that we have got a serious and existential problem within Catholicism, and that's to do with narcissistic leadership within the bishops. I think that when we look at the bishops and we look at the profile of many of them, we see men who appear to be there mainly for their own power and authority. And certainly since whistleblowing, I've gone back and looked very carefully at the bishops in Scotland, and I see a culture of bullying. I see a culture of tyranny. I see a culture that is unspeakably poor. And again, reflecting back into my day job, one which would not be tolerated without investigation. And so I think we need to have a really strong look at how bishops are appointed. I think the secretive Terna system of appointing bishops has to be totally reformed, and Pope Francis could do that with a stroke of a pen if he chose to. If you gave me a weekend, I could come up with a better system to select bishops than the one that the Catholic Church uses. And my final, because we are rushing, I know that, the final one, and I think it's really, really important in terms of power abuse, is the total failure to address the role of women in the church. Sister Chichester was at a conference recently, and she said, she was asked the question, why women can't be priests. I'm reading this out. And Chichester's response made my spine tingle. It's the wrong question, she declared. The question is single, it's basic, it's universal, it's the only one, and it is, are women human? And if women are human, they should be able to do all the things that humans do, and they do in every other sphere of the world. Why the hell not in the Catholic Church?
You're here, Brian. Thank you for that contribution. And can I just say that I know that you think abuse of power starts in the seminaries, and I can recommend that you look online at today's tablet where Brian has got an article about that subject, worth a look. Francis and Tom, I'm going to hurry you both, but could I come to you first, Francis? Just tell us what your burning issue is.
I think I've probably said it a number of times already. I think the burning issue is that we all take responsibility. We own our church, we own our faith communities. There are plenty of resources within our own community to solve this. I mean, I even notice online there's Sheila Hollins, who I know, and she's a person of great experience there in the UK, really committed person that is a great resource, will help people. It's all about us doing it together.
Thank you very much, Francis. And Tom, what about you? What's your big issue?
Well, I'm going to read the statement that I sent in because that'll make it shorter. How's that sound? My issue is an amalgam of everything else, but I look at it from more of an academic point at this stage of my life, at this stage of the game. The community of followers of Jesus does not have to be set up like a monarchy. The commonly taught belief, excuse me, that the hierarchical model was given to Jesus given by Jesus to St. Peter is a myth. The hierarchical model we have lived with has created an aristocracy, the clerical caste, and in reality, the clerical caste runs everything. Had there not been an obsession with the image and power of the institution, the countless people whose lives have been devastated by sexual or spiritual abuse might well not have been damaged. The age of monarchies is over. That mode of government may have worked at one time, but no longer. Unquestioning obedience to anything a pope, a bishop, a priest has created and sustained a highly toxic culture in the church. It serves only to fortify the power of a few, and power, not money, is the basic currency in the church's governmental system. Realistically, we know that the monarchical model The monarchical system won't change on its own. No monarchy has ever changed on its own. At least not in our lifetime will it change. But that doesn't mean we have to tolerate and enable the parts of it that are destructive and that have been a major impediment to Catholicism from being fully Christian. Sexual abuse debacle has been the worst catastrophe to hit the church in well over 1,000 years. It makes the Protestant Reformation look like a glorified debating society. It has not been just the actual victims who've been abused and violated, but anyone who placed their trust in the system, expecting it to act like the body of Christ. Since this monstrous phenomenon, which has been part of the church since the beginning, received widespread publicity over 40 years ago, we have heard countless statements of apology, of regret, of shame from church leaders. We have seen countless programs, policies, processes, protocols issued and been told by those who caused this nightmare that they have now cured it. But the progress in the movement for compassion and justice happened in spite of the words, and it happened because of us. It happened because the victims and their supporters, the real church, went into action and have stayed in action. This nightmare will not end until the system that created it, nourished it, and continues to enable it has either ended, or those who are prolonging it get the picture that it is ending. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Lots and lots of issues in there. You know, this discussion could go on for hours, but we only have a few minutes left. There's so many issues there about obedience, about secrecy, about the need for change. We had lots of questions coming in about, is the church capable of change? And I think that's something I would like to, I can see that Carolina's had her virtual hand up for quite some time, and I'm going to bring her in a moment. But if we could just very quickly, briefly address that issue. Should we be optimistic? Should we have hope? Can the church change? Somebody wrote in saying that, you know, that you can't teach a rattlesnake to eat carrots, and, you know, the church, we can't persuade them to change. What's your view? Tom, let's start with you there. Can they change?
You first off, you cannot convince the rattlesnake to have salad. That's not going to work. And I think the change, if there is any change, it has been forced from the outside. That has worked. But it has been forced. I think if we continue to think it's going to change from within due to altruistic feelings on the part of the system, we're being naive and blind, and also harmful to the victims that are out there and the ones who still haven't come forward. So no, I don't think the system's going to change on its own. It'll change when it's forced to change. And as far as my beliefs are concerned, it's happening. It's happening not fast enough and not in enough places, but from my global view, it is happening. And I only say best thing, continue to support those who are making it happen.
Thank you very much, Tom. Francis, do you agree? You think they're capable of change?
I do. The experience in Australia is once there's been massive public scrutiny, and when public authorities start demanding change, it starts happening. Unfortunately, the church has to be forced. The institution always has to be forced by the state. But once the state gets involved, and once you have that external scrutiny and then sets of obligations, and finally, once the civil laws also change to enable people to bring court action successfully, that also drives change. It's happening in Australia. Children are safer in the institution they used to be, that's for sure. So that change is happening. Cultural change around enabling ourselves as a Catholic faith community to be more relevant to the emerging cultures in which we live. That's the slow train coming.
Thank you, Francis. Brian, very briefly, can they change?
I think they can change if they look to successful change processes outside the church, and one of the ones in Northern Ireland or in South Africa, or wherever has been civil rights movement. And I think through peaceful civil rights protests, I think we can bring change about. One small example, but very good example, we talked about putting money in the plate. There's a Catholic theologian who is called Michelle Somerville, and on Twitter is called Indie Theology, and she has a hashtag boycott the basket. Those are the small changes that I think we can learn from civic society, where major changes were required in terms of the franchise and in civil rights. That's where we need to look.
Thank you. So it's all about people power by the sounds of it. And just I'm sorry to hurry you, but very briefly, if you could just round things up there, do you have hope, faith that they will change?
Unfortunately, not a lot of hope, but that's really from the lived experience of victims and survivors, and the way that despite the many apologies, the promises, the pledges, that actually the lived experience for survivors and victims coming forward hasn't really changed in the response that they get from the church. And I think until victims and survivors' voices are at the centre and are not pushed out in a defensive way that puts us as kind of outsiders, then there's not going to be real meaningful change.
Thank you, Anne. I really wish we could have brought more of the audience in tonight, but I think you'll agree that we've certainly had our money's worth out of the panelists, for which we are extremely grateful. Thank you for such fantastic answers. If I could just round things up by going to Carolina, who will have to be the audience representative for the last part of the session. Carolina, you've had your hand up for quite some time. Could we just finish things off with you? You want to come in here?
Very quickly, that one of the chief problems is that we are stuck in an 18th century monarchy and we cannot budge the top guys, and this is really the problem, you know. And I know we've been into this, but until we can get the hierarchy to, well, I think we need a more democratic system, you know. It's just outrageous, because we cannot, any voice is not heard, any of this, one of the most important issues, or any of the other issues that have been, you know, that are on our list. They're not going to listen to us. What are we going to do? Go to the Vatican and demonstrate in the streets? And, you know, it's, I don't know how you move them.
Thank you for that contribution, Carolina. I think from what Brian was saying, it's about people power. So maybe it is that kind of, you know, raid on the Vatican is not so outlandish. And thank you very much.